All right, enough merriment to the pain.
Yeah, let's get this over quickly.
Let's talk about the concept of pain versus merriment in this podcast. So are we doing this for fun, or is this like the baton death march through the history of philosophy?
Yeah. Exactly. That's what I felt like. I'm like,
there are many things that I do as a fun leisure time activity that then I get obsessed enough about that I'm doing unpleasant things in the service of them. And I think that's true for any sport or anything that you're, if you're recording in a studio, that's pretty grueling. If you're serious about anything, you're going to have some unpleasant parts.
Well, all right. This is definitely one of the unpleasant ones for me.
yeah. And it was too long for something this, I was going to say technical, but maybe wordy is the right. This was unpleasant.
So Husserl has a particularly obtuse style, and I think it was just exacerbated because this was intended to be like a much later clarification of the big picture thing, and there was a lot assumed. It's just very difficult going. There's no doubt this is one of the hardest things we've read.
So I chose this, I think, really just because it was assigned to us as an introduction to Husserl in the Intro to Continental Philosophy graduate course that Wes and I were in together. And in fact, Wes, you presented on it, right?
Yeah, I still have the presentation right up.
And did you feel like you understood it at the time?
Well, at the time, I just felt panicked, as I felt about everything then in grad school. But now I look at it and I'm like, wow. And then the notes, I have this old copy of the Cartesian Meditations with all my underlining, and I definitely looked like I understood it a lot better back then.
I chose this because it's supposed to be a summary of his philosophy. A lot of the ideas put forth here came out in this book called Ideas from 1913. And again, for the most part, this was based on lectures from 1929. So toward the end of his career, and he was trying to reformulate things to give a nice summary in these lectures in Paris, which actually there is another version of this called The Paris Lectures that's only 40 pages long. And we probably should have read that, but I didn't think of that.
I understand.
So the Cartesian Meditations, this was 170 pages long or something like that. I don't know if it's much more technical than the Paris Lectures. I couldn't get a hold of that text before this recording, but I'm sure he put a lot more time into trying to work out the bugs. This was his more maturely thought out version of it. And a lot of what the difference between this, his later work, and his earlier work is also the difference between what people associate with Husserl and his followers, with Heidegger. Just a high-level overview. He invented this discipline that he calls phenomenology. The word was floating around before that, and Hegel called his big book the Phenomenology of Spirit, and it was used back even, I think I read, in the 17th century or something. Some people were still using it. It kind of came into something close to what it is now following Kant, like one of the followers of Kant. I always thought that it was because Kant makes this distinction between the phenomena, the things that we experience, the things as we experience them, the appearances, and the noumena, the things in reality. And so phenomenology is the study of appearances, the study of the things that appear to us. Is that what you guys all thought?
Yeah.
Yes.
I think that's right.
One of the things I read recently said, actually, no, that would be phenomenalism. If you're saying I'm studying appearances and I know that they are only appearances of something that is sitting behind them, if you're committing yourself to a Kantian metaphysics or something, then you're doing phenomenalism, not phenomenology.
If you're doing phenomenology, you're taking the world as given. In Husserl's sense, you're not taking any stance with respect to the being or non-being of the world, but you're taking your experience of the world as given.
Yes. So that's what phenomenology in all its forms is all about, is describing your experience from a first-person perspective. And this is used even in psychology and in analytic philosophy. So even if you're doing neuropsychology and trying to come up with the neuro equivalent of your thinking of your grandmother to some brain state, and ultimately you're an eliminated materialist and don't want to have psychological terms like thinking of your grandmother in your vocabulary, and so that's why you're doing this correlation, you're still using phenomenology because you're relying on the person you're experimenting on to tell you when he's thinking of his grandmother. That's the only way you could make the correlation. So phenomenology is still around, but it became a big movement in the early 20th century with Husserl, and then Heidegger and Sartre and other folks following around that time. And the big jump normally considered between Husserl and Heidegger is that Husserl supposedly just talks about what is it like to perceive things? What is it like to perceive this object in front of me? Whereas Heidegger makes the jump to talking about the life world, or Sartre talks about what it's like to wait for a friend, these sort of very humanistic kind of things. But at this late stage, by 1929, in Husserl's thought, he actually uses the world the Lebenswelt, the life world. And he has a lot of those elements in here. So it seemed like it was worth, if you're going to get the best possible argument for the fullness of Husserl's kind of picture, this seemed at least the part of his career to look at. And this is the only, maybe again, the Paris lectures themselves accepting, is the only text that you could choose that's not much, much, much longer. In fact, from what I understand, he created this in 1931 as a French translation, right? Because he gave these lectures in German in 1929, but he wanted to leave the French that he had talked to with something. And so he worked with an editor or a translator and issued this in 1931, but he never ended up re-releasing this in its long form in German because he wasn't actually that happy with it. And so in our PDF that we have, there's a bunch of footnotes that say, Husserl marked this sentence as unsatisfactory. And
yeah.
And then he jammed another page written in longhand between these notes to his editor, sort of where he just abandoned it.
Yeah.
But it still seemed like a better option than, because it's the last time he tried to do something reasonably short that would give a comprehensive view of his philosophy, as opposed to, I guess, Phenomenology and the Crisis of the European Sciences is his big book after that, 1936. And that's much, much, much longer. And again, looking back to the Ideas book, 1913, which I've read parts of, it takes him much, much longer in that book to say anything. Even though it seems like it's really dragged out here, it's much worse everywhere else, even if it is a little easier to take because he's more gradual in introducing his technical terminology and just dwells on every point more and more. And so it's maybe easier to understand. That said, you guys can bitch about it all you want.
My biggest complaint about this is just that he introduces terminology, lots and lots of technical terms and new words without defining them. So it gets very difficult. Actually, the first meditation is very clear. The second one is good for about 5 or 10 pages. And then he just goes completely apeshit. And there's so much jargon in this that it's really difficult to follow because you don't know whether something is just another way of him saying something or the translation kind of rewording something, or if he's actually introducing a technical distinction, which for him is really, really important. Like when you finally realize that he makes a distinction between psychological ego and the transcendental ego, which takes a while, by the way, it's really important that you be aware that he's making that distinction. And then there's other stuff where he uses terminology where it doesn't really matter that much. It's really, really difficult to read for that reason more than anything. And he doesn't need to take nearly as much time to say the things that he needs to say.
Yeah. And I'm not even sure that all of the concepts are really that difficult. It's just gratuitously wordy and repetitive.
Yeah, see, I thought the repetition actually helped me to understand the language. And I had a heck of a time. I mean, this is definitely a text you have to read twice. So the first time I'm just struggling, and you've read a paragraph and you realize you have no idea what's been said and you kind of lost your place and you don't remember what this term means. But going through the second time, I was much more comfortable with it. I'm not saying that every word he used, I understood exactly what the distinctions he was making, but I got the general drift. I was able to take some pretty good notes, I think.
Now, was the second reading part of some sadomasochistic ritual, or?
It was my attempt to take notes. We're linking to a PDF that's on this Scribd site that people upload stuff, and it's obviously a scan of a paper copy. And even though this site provides not only the PDF, it provides like a text version and a Kindle version and all this other stuff, it does not convert well. In fact, I think it was scanned at slightly an angle. And so wherever there was underlining, which there was in early parts of this copy of the book, the optical character recognition is absolute garbage. So if you look at the text, like it's just nonsense characters for a while. And even when it worked, it rearranges the order of some of the words.
It's a non-apodictic scan.
Yes. So the text version of that that's posted there is absolutely useless. So I took the PDF and I did a conversion myself using Mobi Pocket Creator or whatever I do to create Kindle stuff. And it was better, but I'll put a screenshot of this on the website. But it ended up with just random font sizes and no spaces between a lot of the words.
Yeah. This whole episode is cursed, I think.
But in any case, it made, even though you could do your underlining and stuff on the Kindle, it made that mostly useless. And so I just felt like I had to go back and sit down at my computer and look through the PDF and take real notes off of it. So that was what the second reading was about.
Get an iPad.
I suppose. And then it got pleasant enough. So we're going to try to go. There are 5 meditations here, and we all read through number 4, right?
Yeah.
Because number 5 is freaking long, is like a third of the whole essay. I did read to the end of it now, so I can give a little summary of it. In some ways, it's one of the more important things because it's when he introduces the whole life world and the existence of other people and stuff. But I had even thought that, we could just look at the first couple meditations because that gives you a flavor of what his system is and what the task of phenomenology is.
Yeah, I was just from skimming the fifth meditation and looking at some secondary literature, it would have been more interesting to focus simply on the other minds problem and Husserl's take on it instead of all this.
I'm happy to take it up in another episode if you guys want to spend more time on it.
So what is Husserl's enterprise in this book then? What's he trying to do?
Why don't you tell us?
Well, it is called the Cartesian Meditations, so we can take our clue, I guess, from that. His goal is essentially similar in the sense that he is looking to take a scientific approach, as it were, to philosophy and find a way to ground philosophy scientifically and in turn hence ground the sciences. So his enterprise is similar to what Descartes states his enterprise to be in the Meditations on First Philosophy, which is he's trying to find this absolutely certain ground upon which we can build a foundation of scientific knowledge. The difference is that Husserl is not going to undertake a program of radical doubt.
Yeah, and he has some nasty things to say about, well, as nasty as he gets, but which is not very nasty, about the current state of philosophy and the current state of the sciences, and it actually most of it still applies today. That it's so splintered that there's no common ground in terms of methodology. There's no common ground in terms of basic assumptions. He even says that there are philosophy conferences. He says the philosophers meet, but unfortunately not the philosophies. There's no common mental space that these things share.
This is where I think the whole goal is misguided. It's like calling for bipartisanship. I reject the whole premise.
Yeah, so I don't agree with the enterprise, which is part of the problem, but he's doing what he's doing, and he's very important, pivotal figure, all that kind of stuff. So, Mark, why don't you explain to us then what he means by the term apodictic? Apodictic. Yes, which we get on page 15 already.
He didn't make that up. That's just indubitable, right?
But it means something specific for him.
Well, that's non-being is inconceivable.
Yes, it's certainty is what the point is. And what is cool about this is that whereas for Descartes, or sort of maybe in your ordinary sense, I mean, if you're certain of something, it has to be true. That's sort of the point of it. It's not just a psychological state that if you've reached Descartes' goal in getting certain knowledge, that means for sure this knowledge is true. Whereas Husserl gives almost a psychological definition of it in saying that it's just inconceivable to you that it be false. But that doesn't mean that it's inconceivable that someday you might have grounds to doubt it. So he sort of leaves a loophole there for himself. And, it actually makes it achievable. If you set things up such that we have to reach this field of knowledge that is wholly other than us, that is nothing that we could, this godlike certainty, right? The certainty that only God has, then by definition, you're never going to fulfill your goal. But if he makes it in some way relative to the capabilities of human knowledge, then okay, well, at least we've got a shot here. And he thinks that in fact, if you look at it as a psychological state, there's a wide range of things that are apodictic to us, right? That we can't conceive the opposite of.
Maybe there was a nuance here that I'm missing. I thought for him, what he was saying was that apodictic meant there was a certainty in the sense that you couldn't conceive the opposite. Like It was sort of like there was a law of non-contradiction. So it has to be the case and it can't possibly be otherwise. But also you have to add the criteria of the unimaginableness of non-being. In other words, it's not just the case that it's true and its opposite can't be true, but that it actually in fact holds. This doesn't encompass for him the realm of purely logical truths or definitional truths that we could make up. It has to be incontrovertible and absolutely existing to the extent that you couldn't imagine that it couldn't possibly not exist, which seems to me to be a slightly stronger claim than what you guys just mentioned.
So it's a form of self-evidence, right?
Yes.
What's important here is it's not, the empiricists took empirical knowledge to be a self-evident given in a way, right? So he's still rejecting, along with Descartes, the idea that the empirical will provide that foundation. So I think you're right. It's not going to be simply formal, logical truths, but it is going to be something that's non-empirical, where you go through an exercise of trying to doubt, let's say, or trying to assume the opposite and finding out that you can't conceive of it.
Right.